So welcome everyone to Misinformation and the Election in Texas, a What to Expect 2020 Town Hall. My name is Grace Linzer, and I am on the Membership and National Engagement team at PEN America. For anyone who's not familiar with PEN America, I just want to give you a brief introduction to our work. So for almost 100 years, PEN has stood at the intersection of literature and human rights to protect free expression in the United States and worldwide. Today, in the midst of a global pandemic and an unprecedented election, PEN is continuing this fight through the What to Expect 2020 campaign, which aims to combat the surge of disinformation and misinformation that poses a threat to our free and fair elections. This effort includes disinformation defense workshops, community-level virtual town halls, and events with journalists and community organizers at the local level like this one, and a wider variety of other resources that you can check out at pen.org. That's pen.org. There you can check out our tip sheet on how to talk to your friends and family who share misinformation. You can take our interactive quiz to test your election disinformation knowledge, and you can learn more about how you can spot and check and stop disinformation. I want to thank you all for joining us here tonight and give special thanks to our speakers, Justin, James, and Mimi when she joins us for taking time out of their busy schedules to share this hour with us. And many thanks, of course, to our moderator for this evening, Cassie Fibio, who I just want to introduce briefly before passing off the conversation to. So Cassie is the Curriculum and Research Coordinator for the Campus Vote Project, which works with universities, community colleges, faculty, students, and election officials to reduce barriers to student voting. And their goal is to help campuses institutionalize reforms that empower students with the information they need to register and vote. Cassie is also a communication studies PhD candidate. Sounds like a very busy PhD candidate at the University of Texas, Austin, where she studies the intersection of political communication and higher education. For 5 years, Cassie was the graduate program coordinator for Texas Votes. And during that time, the organization registered nearly 20,000 students to vote and led the university to receive national recognition. So Cassie, thank you so much again for leading this conversation this evening, and I'll pass it off to you to get us started. And maybe we can start with questions for James and Justin while we're waiting for Mimi to join.
Of course. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. If anyone is interested in learning more about Campus Vote Project, you can simply go to campusvoteproject.org or follow us on any of our social media, which is just Campus Vote. We've tried TikTok for the first time as an organization, so they're really pushing that right now. So a little background on our speakers. Justin Miller covers politics and government, among other things, for the Texas Observer. He previously covered politics and policy for the American Prospect in Washington, D.C., and has also written for The Intercept, The New Republic, and In These Times. We also have James Bergen, who covers Texas politics for the Dallas Morning News. He has covered immigration, public safety, and voting rights, and has traveled on assignment to the U.S. Supreme Court and Houston during Hurricane Harvey. Before joining the news in 2017, he worked for the Austin American-Statesman and the Los Angeles Times. And finally, we have Mimi Marziani, who is hopping on any moment here, and she's the president of the Texas Civil Rights Project. She has an extensive background in civil rights advocacy and nonprofit management, as well as expertise in election law. I think we summoned her. Ms. Marziani previously directed voting rights programs for multiple political campaigns and committees. In 2014, Ms. Marziani led the first coordinated statewide voter protection program for progressive candidates and groups in Texas. She teaches election law and policy at the University of Texas School of Law and serves on the NYU Board of Trustees. So thank you all for joining us today. I really am excited to start this conversation. So our first question for everyone is, speaking from each of your own areas of work, what role does local journalism play in the 2020 election? And we can start with Justin.
Yeah, thanks to y'all for having us and hosting this event. Glad to be here. Yeah, I mean, I think from the perspective of political coverage and coverage of the 2020 elections, obviously, I think having strong local journalism is always critical. And I think in Texas, we have, very strong media ecosystem, and they have done a really good job, I think, of covering these elections and, kind of the ebbs and flows in recent months in very challenging times. And, I think having robust, strong local newsrooms that have, the connections to the communities and, historical knowledge and context that it can kind of provide to stories and ongoing coverage, I think is irreplaceable. And especially, when we're seeing all this attention in Texas from national publications, as the state is increasingly seen as a battleground state. Local journalism is filling in holes and gaps in coverage in ways that, typically get passed over by when national outlets kind of come into Texas and cover elections. So yeah, I think like always, and more so than ever, I think local journalism in these next couple of weeks and beyond is going to be critical.
Thank you. James, same question?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a twofold mission, really, that journalists have here. The first is really to educate the public about how they can go about casting their ballots. There's a lot of people that perhaps are first-time voters or are worried about how to vote during a pandemic. And firstly, it's our job to help them understand what are going to be some of the precautions that are going to be taken during this pandemic for their safety, and some of the things that are, quite frankly, not going to be done, so that people have a good understanding of what they're looking at going into early voting, into voting in November 3rd during a crucial election. And secondly, so that covers, how to get registered, where to send all your stuff. If you want to vote by mail, what does that entail? What qualifies you? And I think we've done a good job of that. And secondly, I think it's keeping people informed about the changes and sometimes the problems that there are during the elections. Administering elections is not an easy task, and Texas doesn't make it any easier. Because the way they handle them, it's not a uniform way to do it, and that leads to a lot of problems. We've had issues with vote by mail. We've had issues with conflicting and mixed instructions, and as Mimi Marziani and the good people at the Texas Civil Rights Project know, we've had issues with last-minute changes to our election laws. And that's really part of our responsibility as well, informing people of those changes and what is the latest information that we have, because not despite the fact that there has been a tradition by courts not to get involved in election procedures and making election changes in the 11th hour. That's quite frankly what we've seen here in Texas. And so it's kept a lot of us up late nights trying to figure out first what the court rulings mean and what impact they'll have on the good people of Texas trying to vote. So that's how I view our role in journalism.
And Mimi?
Wonderful. First, I'm sorry I'm late. As Cassie might have mentioned, I had some mom duties tonight and a 2-year-old who was not on the same timeline as the panel, but I'm happy to be here with everybody, and especially with James and Justin. I really appreciate all that you do. I agree with everything you said. I'll add 2 points about local journalism in particular, which is that in Texas, like in many states, the election system is very decentralized. So you actually have pretty profound differences from county to county, from city to city. And so for that reason, it's absolutely critical that there are local journalists on the ground who are providing that sort of detailed information to the voters of that jurisdiction. And so, I mean, I will, just an example from the last 10 days, the Texas Civil Rights Project brought a lawsuit against Bergen County, home to San Antonio, because it did not have a sufficient number of polling locations. I'm really happy to report that we won that lawsuit. And we're able to get more polling locations, particularly in communities that are overwhelmingly Latinx. And so that's really important information for the people of Bexar County to know. That's not the type of thing that's ever going to get picked up statewide. And so it's a reason that we rely heavily on local journalists. Another reason, and I think James and Justin had threads of this, is that in Texas, we have seen a really cynical decision by the people leading the state to try to make voting and voter registration more difficult, seemingly because they believe the majority of people don't agree with their policies. And one piece of trying to make participation more difficult has been, in my view, manufacturing chaos. And we see this particularly from our state attorney general, Ken Paxton, who's been sending out recently letter opinions. They have no force of law. He's been doing this over the last several months, but it's scary to normal people when he's accusing people of running afoul of the law or throwing out interpretations that have not been sanctioned by a court. And so particularly when you have folks at the state level with a really loud megaphone who are intentionally trying to confuse and intimidate voters, it is critical that there are trusted voices at the local level that people can turn to do exactly what James was saying, understand the nuts and bolts of how to cast a ballot that counts and understand the fundamentals of their voting rights.
Thank you so much. So our next question, or moving forward, we are seeing misinformation used as a tool of voter suppression to promote division, cast doubt over the integrity of our elections, and influence the election's outcomes. Not only is misinformation prevalent on our social media feeds, but we are also seeing it spread by our state and national leaders, which Mimi's already touched on here. Mimi, what challenges are you seeing with regard to mis and disinformation in Texas? How are you and other voting rights advocates confronting these challenges and getting trusted information through to the voters?
I really anticipated that question, huh? So let me give you, and it's, of course, I think that's a great question. I've been thinking about this a lot. Let me give y'all an example of exactly this. So when COVID hit Texas hard in late March, there was a conversation that started in Texas and across the country about who was eligible to cast a ballot remotely. So specifically, who's eligible to vote by mail. And the Texas Civil Rights Project and some other groups actually sued the state because we thought, and still think, that under existing law, the definition of disability is broad enough to encompass any of us who aren't immune to COVID. And so this was a legal question, right? I mean, the question of how broad does that disability definition extend? And look, that is the type of thing that is appropriate for courts to decide. And unlike some of the decisions we're seeing coming out now rapid fire, I mean, this was months ago with plenty of time to educate voters. However, rather than wait for this issue to play out in the courts, the leaders of the state government, particularly Ken Paxton, started going to Twitter, sending out letter opinions, and making his own claims about what disability meant, even though he knew full well that this issue was actually going to be decided, rightfully so, by the Texas Supreme Court. But he sent out tweets and letters claiming that there was a more narrow definition, and even worse, claiming that his office would prosecute voters for running afoul of that law. And would go after groups as well who are promoting voting by mail. So this to me is one of the most extraordinary examples of this, because this is a official, the top law enforcement agent in the state of Texas, who knows full well that the courts should decide this issue. He was involved in litigation. He knew it was actually going quite quickly, but instead used his official power to try to intimidate voters. And so that's a pretty extraordinary example. What do we do about it? Well, the Texas Supreme Court ultimately did decide the issue in, unfortunately, a rather confusing decision. The Texas Supreme Court said basically that not being immune to COVID isn't enough to qualify to vote by mail, but it can be one factor you can consider along with other physical conditions. So in other words, if you have high blood pressure and you're not immune, that makes you more susceptible, you can go vote by mail. And so what we decided to do to try to help get information out, honestly, we went to local press, we went to local elected officials in particular and asked them to put information on their website. TCRP has actually launched our own public education campaign. We've spent $300,000, which for an organization like ours is quite a lot of money to run TV ads, radio ads, digital ads, newspaper ads, explaining to people, things like this, explaining to them their rights. So that's an example, and then some of the ways that we've tried to counter it. Although I will just add that, at the end of the day, it's very difficult for a civil society group to effectively go up against some of the most powerful people in the state.
Thank you. James, what challenges are you seeing? And can you specifically talk about your role as a reporter in confronting those challenges?
Yeah, one of the challenges, just to go off Mimi's answer, is that the rules are changing so much. And then also to Mimi's point, the fact that we can't really get straight answers. To her point, the Texas Supreme Court basically just left it up to voters to decide whether you qualify to vote by mail, and that's up to you. And then you've got officials like Attorney General Paxton who say that if for some reason you don't qualify, but you believe that you do qualify, that he is liable to prosecute you. And so it's very difficult. There's no real clear answer there. And officials who can give you clear answers refuse to do so. So that's tough. And it's tough explaining it to readers and voters who want to cast their votes. And it's really their fundamental right, and they should be able to. And I think state officials, have a responsibility to give them a clear answer, but haven't been doing that for whatever reason that is. And the other main thing is just, people asking about vote by mail and are the polls going to be safe, and all this uncertainty around COVID-19. Well, we as the local press try to say, hey, here are the things people are doing to make sure that voting is safe. Here is the suggested timeline if you are going to vote by mail that experts are recommending, which I think at this point we're pretty late in the game. I hope that everyone has sent their vote by mail ballots, and also giving them ideas on how to track their votes, but there is just that uncertainty, and there's not enough. Obviously, as Mimi said, there's people, voting rights experts, elections experts, who are trying to help and get the message out about how to do this thing right. I don't think there's enough state officials giving that same reassurance. And so it falls a lot on us, the local press, to press those people for questions, to voice that frustration from readers who, like I said, just really want to express their fundamental right to vote. So I think that's the biggest challenge, all the uncertainty that there is. And there really is just so much to keep up with. We were talking a little bit before we went live with the panel about just how much of a burden it is just to try to keep up with it. We're 2 weeks away from the election, and we're just kind of all just waiting for it to be done. But it's a lot to keep up with.
And Justin, what challenges do you see? And specifically, how is journalism responding? And is there anything that needs to change?
Yeah, like James just talked about, I think it's just so incredibly difficult for both journalists and the public to kind of keep up with all these ongoing changes. And, there's all these last minute legal actions being taken, and it's very difficult to kind of, for your typical Texan, to keep up with, all these last minute developments and changes and kind of know how that all kind of factors into their own ability to vote. It was already, this unprecedented challenge and concern about voting in a pandemic. That was already its own huge challenge. And when you have, as Mimi put it, state leaders actively manufacturing chaos. I thought that was a very good way to put it. And, you know, you have the President of the United States kind of constantly and blatantly fear-mongering about rampant voter fraud, and, you know, trying to create concerns about the legitimacy of voting by mail. And you have, you know, state leaders in Texas kind of taking their cues from Trump, whether it's Governor Abbott, Attorney General Paxton, and other state leaders kind of just constantly churning out these attempts to, you know, fearmonger about voter fraud, and taking all these actions, whether it's, you know, these legal opinions from Paxton or Abbott's attempts to limit, you know, drop off locations for vote by mail. It's just this constant churn of stuff on top of, you know, this global pandemic. So I think that creates a lot of confusion, and I think it's increasingly difficult for press in Texas and everywhere to you know, do the reporting that, you know, pushes back on misinformation, and tries to, you know, kind of sort out exactly what's happening on a day by day and hour by hour basis as things constantly change. And on top of that, you know, I think it's more and more difficult to get that information out to the public in a way that cuts through, you know, these chaotic news cycles. And, you know, it's easy to miss 100 different things that happen on any given day. So yeah, I think that's a huge challenge. And I mean, in terms of what I think journalism and the journalism industry, you know, kind of needs to do, and I think has done a good job of, is, you know, kind of just doubling that resolve to call out these officials when they're, you know, blatantly lying or not, you know, providing any clear information on, you know, things that are directly affecting the right to vote, and really just, you know, more so than ever, you know, kind of holding the powerful accountable, even when it's, you know, kind of harder than ever to do so.
If I could add one thing there to Justin, just like, I think he's right in that we need to, I mean, it's not like reinventing the wheel, right? We just have to be able to call out, you know, fear mongering, as Justin calls it, for what it is. You know, a couple of weeks ago, Attorney General Paxton really widely publicized these election fraud charges that he had in a small East Texas county in Gregg County from 2 years ago. And he made a huge deal, put it out in a press release to the statewide press corps. And you got to really ask yourself when you see something like that, what is the aim? What is the goal of that, right? You're dropping this a few weeks before the election when you know that there's going to be a huge increase in mail voting. What is the message he's trying to send? And I don't think that there's any question, you know. I think what people, and maybe Mimi or Justin can speak to this, but I think time and time again, election experts have told us there is no evidence of widespread electoral fraud that's swinging any major elections, despite what the president wants to say. What we do know is that perhaps sometimes when it does happen, it swings small local elections, which is exactly what that was in 2018. And so we at the Dallas Morning News, we pointed that out. We said this is in the context of Republicans, particularly General Paxton, casting you know, doubts about mail voting. It's been a month-long fight. He's been very clear about where he is on mail voting, and he's dragging the top law enforcement office in the state into this little small town election from 2 years ago. I think people can, you know, to Justin's point about cutting through the other stuff, I think people can read through that when you put it in that context, but it takes a good local press that has been covering this stuff for years to be able to point that out.
And that actually perfectly leads into the next question I have for you, James, like very perfectly, actually. So part of the success of misinformation is the way it sows discord, undermines confidence, and threatens our sense of shared knowledge, right? So as a journalist, how do you weigh whether or not your reporting may feed a narrative that is harmful or erodes the public's confidence in the election against your obligation to hold people accountable and report on what our leaders are saying? Are there other ethical dilemmas that you face in this work?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's something that we've dealt with at the Dallas Morning News too. I think I referenced this to this a little bit earlier, but we've had some issues with our mail ballots in Dallas County. We had some problems with the postal service or with the elections administrator's office, where some people's ballots were instead of getting sent off to the elections office, you would put them in your mailbox, and they would end up right back to your address a couple of days later. And so we had to really think about, okay, what is going on here? What is the issue? Is this an issue with the postal service? Is this an issue with the elections office? How many people is this happening to? Is it one or two people, or is it more? And we got to enough people that we felt like, okay, this is a realistic problem. We wrote a story about it after the July runoffs. The county, it was very hard to get a hold of them. So what I would say to elections offices is to please respond when people have doubts, because that just makes it worse. That makes the situation seem to the average reader like, something's fishy here. Why aren't they answering questions? But finally, they got back to us and said, okay, we're fixing it. They redesigned the envelope so that in November elections, we would avoid this problem. And it didn't work. And it was happening again in November. And so we had to go back and write more stories about it. And then finally, they got together with the Postal Service, and it appears to be solved, right? But we were having an issue on our end, where we were sort of saying, and the people who were feeding this to us were, Democratic precinct chairs and election judges, like the people who most care about elections and about elections being done right. It wasn't just some nut, saying like, this isn't right, and trying to bring down the elections office. It was like really verified sources, people who really care about this, people who have skin in the game, who are saying this. So you really just got to vet your sources. You got to really think about this, and again, put it into that context of, and because these people were saying, we don't want to feed into this Trump narrative of voter fraud and stuff like that, but we do see the potential for like a bigger problem to be happening here, and we just want to get it solved before November. So we put all of that context into those stories, and I think that helps out. If you're just straight with people, I think again, the readers will figure it out.
Can I answer this too? Do you mind? James, I thought those were two really good examples. On the Gregg County thing, I've seen a lot of messaging research that the minute that you can have a group of people and you can tell them all the statistics, which are absolutely true, you are more likely to get struck by lightning than have somebody impersonate you at the polls. Mail-in voter fraud is also, vanishingly rare. When it ever happens, it is along the fact pattern of what happened in Gregg County, which was a 2-year-old case, involved 20 ballots in a really small town Democratic primary. Like that, that sort of really small fry thing, but it hardly ever happens. However, you can show people all of those statistics, and then you say the word voter fraud, and you walk out and you give them a test a week later, and all they remember is voter fraud. And so there's something very about that phrase and about that idea that people have a hard time shaking. And so, in my estimation, like that just explains why the Attorney General's office was making such a big deal of that case at this moment, right? That they've seen the same messaging research, they've seen the same focus groups I have, and they are absolutely trying to seed a narrative. And I think you're right to be cautious, because regardless of whatever happened in Gregg County 2 years ago, it was a very small incident. And of course, if somebody broke the law, they should be punished. But that the motivations between Ken Paxton's office blowing this up and acting like it was really recent and sending it out all over the place. And honestly, even being involved with the case, I don't understand why a state attorney general would be involved in something that a local prosecutor had brought 2 years ago. I think is all reason to be suspect, because there are absolutely partisan motivations. And, by the way, Ken Paxton, I mean, this is out there publicly, but he also serves as a co-chair for the Lawyers for Trump campaign. So he absolutely has kind of blatant partisan interests. The other thing I'll say to your question on a more fundamental level, I mean, that kind of goes to the partisan trickery piece. But I think on a more fundamental level, I've struggled a lot with the fact that, I'm the first one to say that our democracy needs to be better. that it is for way too long. We have run elections in ways that have cut out folks, and especially have cut out Black Americans, other Americans of color, people with disabilities, poorer people, students, all sorts of populations. And therefore they've been excluded from positions of power. And I've spent my whole career basically suing the government over this. At the same time, our democracy also fundamentally works. And if everybody stops believing in our democracy, that's when you slide away from a democracy. And so I have actually found a challenge in this moment where, you know, for the first time in my career, you are having people who hold very powerful positions attacking what seems to be the ideals of our democracy and like the idea of our democracy, and figuring out how I talk about legitimate ways that we should be working to make our democracy better, but at the same time being clear, as I feel very strongly, that the United States of America does have a great democracy, and it has served this country, and it's something that we should invest in making better and that we should really protect, not something that we should throw out and start anew with some other system of government. But I think that has been kind of a fine line, and it is made harder. It's just to bring up a topic that I'm sure you guys talk about a lot. I think it is made a lot harder in the age of social media, where like the nuance of a conversation like that gets kind of sucked away very quickly.
That perfectly transitions into my next question, which is for Justin, which Facebook said it would prohibit ads that make premature decisions about the election, as well as ads that delegitimize the outcome. For example, this would include calling a method of voting inherently fraudulent or corrupt, or using isolated incidents of voter fraud to delegitimize the result of an election. Is Facebook's response sufficient? And what do you think needs to happen to combat the issues it is working to address? As well as, what advice would you offer to voters in Texas to check for misinformation and find sources that they can rely on for truthful information?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think it's at least a good first step by Facebook to commit to doing that. However, I'm rather skeptical that just the prohibition of ads relating to premature decisions trying to sway the perception of the election results and try and kind of so kind of undermine the legitimacy of the results. Purely focusing on the ad aspect, I think is kind of coming up short, and is not necessarily in any way kind of enough to address kind of what's going to be just a storm of chaos and dissent and unrest as the polls close and in the hours and days afterwards. I think a lot of that is just frankly kind of inevitable. It's going to happen. It's going to be a mess. It's going to be, frankly, I think kind of scary to see what happens. But I mean, I think it's fair to say that Facebook's handling of issues of democracy and elections and political campaigns, both recently and kind of over the past few years, has not been sufficient, and they've been kind of multiple accounts fallen short. And I think what they're in kind of actually coming to terms with what their responsibility as the world's largest social media platform, what responsibility they have, civic duty really in both the United States and around the world, in confronting misinformation and disinformation, violent extremism and all that. I think that's is an ongoing problem and challenge, and admittedly is a big and complicated one. And I don't think Facebook has figured out how to balance the fact that there's this giant corporation that is about making money and has access to all of this information and billions of members and everything, and balancing that with the fact that they have an immense responsibility in civics. As far as, and I don't honestly, I don't know what the solutions are to all this, or what the right answer is. I think it's something that we need to continually be talking about. But yeah, as far as advice for voters, and I'm gonna try and hold myself to this on election night and the days after, is just be very careful about avoiding or about relying too heavily on things you're seeing fly by in social media on election night and things that are going viral about any number of things related to the elections. Kind of attempts to create narratives, speculation about outcomes and things that may have happened that have not been verified. You just see this so much on Twitter, especially, where something that is blatantly false or half true or kind of misleading goes viral. Kind of gets embedded in people's minds as reality, and then it's debunked, and a lot of people just never follow up and realize that this information that they got is wrong. And I think that's going to be just increasingly important on election night, to just be very careful about how you're consuming information. Be careful and double and triple check sources of where you're getting things. And I think local press, I think, is going to be a very good resource on this, as we cover from polling, in person from polling locations. If there's reported problems with ballot counting and all that as things kind of play out, and also just local elections offices and administrators, I think, are going to be a good source of clear information. And so yeah, I would advise people to just be careful and be patient also, because I don't think there's necessarily going to be a clear result on election night. And yeah, I think it's just as usual, be careful with kind of news consumption in this wild world of social media, especially. So yeah.
Definitely. So just as a reminder to our attendees, if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat and I can be sure to then ask those of our panelists. Moving forward, Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, policy decisions made in the past 4 years, and mis and disinformation surrounding these pieces. So Justin, what are journalists doing to center and support disproportionately impacted communities?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll speak to what we are doing and have been trying to do at the Texas Observer specifically. I think a core part of our mission as a independent magazine news outlet for the past 66 years has been to kind of uniquely advance a vision of a more just and equitable Texas, and an essential part of that, I think, has long been to tell the stories about things that are affecting communities of color and disadvantaged communities in Texas, center those stories, make it that a top priority and kind of a core part of our editorial vision. Elevate voices that have long been kind of ignored or not given a platform, and empower people to tell their own stories and give their own perspectives. I think we've long reported on civil rights abuses and voter suppression against that obviously wildly disproportionately impacts people of color in Texas. The criminal justice system, again, that disproportionately incarcerates people of color, and overly militarized borders and the effects of that on border communities, and disparities in healthcare and pollution, environmental justice, and the list goes on. I think we've always tried to live up to that, and this is an ongoing process, and we haven't always lived up to that, and we can always do better and more thoughtful job, as I think you know, as this is a, you know, kind of an ongoing thing that I think journalism as an industry and outlets and journalists individually need to kind of continuously grapple with and improve upon. So yeah, I'll make one last plug. We at the Texas Observer are just launched a new Indigenous Affairs desk in Texas, which we're super excited about. I think reporting on Indigenous communities in Texas has long been insufficient and overlooked and ignored by media outlets across the state, including the Observer. And so I think this is super exciting, and we're happy to launch that project. So yeah.
That's awesome. That's really exciting. Has it launched yet, or is it getting ready to launch?
Yeah. So the desk consists of our relatively new editor-in-chief, Tristan Atone, and our brand new reporter, Polly Denicla, who comes from the Navajo Times. And they're spearheading the project, and we'll be collaborating with other reporters and editors, and all of the stories that come out of that will be open source and available for republication by other outlets too.
And Grace dropped the link in the chat below. James, what, if anything, needs to change so that journalism better centers Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities?
A lot needs to change. I mean, first of all, you got to have representation of Black, Brown, Indigenous, LGBTQ people in newspapers or in news organizations, and you got to pay those people what they need to be paid. We were talking about this beforehand, but we just unionized the Dallas Morning News. We're the first newspaper in Texas to unionize since the San Antonio Light in the late 1980s went out of business. And we're doing that because there's a wave of news organizations across the country that are unionizing, because we've seen news organizations go out of business, be bled dry by hedge funds, and have ownership that, quite frankly, doesn't invest in the type of important local journalism that we're talking about that is needed here. So we need representation. We need people to have the Rooney Rule in place when there are top positions in the papers, like an editor-in-chief position, any major title on the masthead, any major reporting position. I really commend Justin's organization. I mean, they've got such great leadership at the Observer, and a lot of representation there, people of color, LGBT folks. I really commend that. But our organizations and legacy media have to do a better job about getting those things done. You can't represent people of color, underserved communities, if you don't understand their issues. You really can't understand their issues if you don't have people who look like them and know their experiences out there doing the reporting. I'll just give you an example. I mean, Dallas and Texas is 40% Latino. We are not 40% Latino at the Dallas Morning News, not even close. So that's the kind of stuff that really needs to happen. People need to put their money where their mouth is, have their representation in place, and really go and look for it. I understand it's not easy, but we got to get it done. I'm really fired up about this. I've been reading Ibram Kendi's, what's the name of the book? I'm blanking on it. The one about being an anti-racist. And so I'm very passionate about it. If I can go back to the disinformation one, just really, really quickly, because that's something else that I get really fired up about. Facebook, companies like that, they're not going to do what needs to get done. And the reason why they're not going to do what needs to get done is because it's in their best interest, it's in their business model not to correct those things. Even organizations, even companies like Twitter, which is where the president does most of his spreading of misinformation, have done a better job than Facebook in terms of trying to slow down the spread of misinformation. They've got recently the sort of think twice button, where if you're going to retweet a story and it says, hey, headlines are misleading, make sure you read that whole story. Just a little thing like that, But quite frankly, organizations like Facebook are not going to do what needs to get done because, again, it's in their business model to not do it. They want you to click. They want you to spread that misinformation because it keeps people online. And quite frankly, what needs to happen is that there needs to be a change in the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which gives them a pass really to put whatever they want on their mediums. If we put something like what they put on Facebook in the Dallas Morning News or in the Texas Observer, we'd get sued out of existence. Gawker Media got sued out of existence because one powerful person didn't like what Gawker Media reported and actually reported, factually reported. And Facebook and tech companies like Facebook get a pass on that because of this kind of obscure law that in the late 1990s was okay for them because it encouraged entrepreneurship and encouraged startups. But now when you have billion-dollar companies that have as many people on them, have as many users to be like a major country in the world, that is just not fair, and that needs to change. And I think what the biggest thing that we can do as the public is to elect people to Congress and to state legislatures who are technically savvy, who understand these issues, so that there can be some actual regulations put in place, because we cannot keep this up for much longer. The amount of change that there has been in technology, that has led to this mis and disinformation that we're talking about on this panel, and there's not enough being done to combat it. You know, we're the good guys, we're the journalists, and Mimi runs a nonprofit, but you heard her. I mean, $300,000 is a lot of money for her organization. $300,000 is chump change. That's like the salary of a mid-level executive at Facebook. So that's really what we need to do. We need change at the national and at the state level from people who understand and can make policy that can actually combat these things.
Thank you. Mimi, can you talk about some of the ways that the Texas Civil Rights Project is centering and supporting Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities, and how others can support them as we approach November 3rd?
Yes, lots of thoughts there, and very much I'm kind of feeling fired up with James. I appreciated all of that. I mean, everything we do is rooted in anti-racism and race equity. And I mean, actually, Justin was kind of giving a good tally of the types of things that TCRP works on. We work on voting rights and increasing power in historically underrepresented communities, particularly Black communities, Indigenous communities, communities of color. And we have office in the border. We're fighting the militarization of the border and the total lack of accountability and the by federal immigration officials and the just dehumanizing of largely brown migrant families coming from Central America. And then we have long been a leader in the fight against criminal injustice, and actually very proud to say that this year, a couple months ago, we actually brought a new, very talented woman in to lead that program. And we have launched a new vision of our criminal law reform efforts that is very explicitly rooted in anti-racism, and then specifically pushing out anti-Black bias. So, you know, really our entire, all of our work and our entire mission revolves around this. I will say, when it comes to communication strategy, something I've been really proud of, and is probably informed by the fact that before I moved to Texas, I worked at a big national nonprofit that is a great organization. But something that I think is problematic in the large, you know, sometimes people in our industry call it the nonprofit industrial complex, is that it is no secret that the people at the top of these organizations are much whiter, older, more likely to be male than the rest of the people working, including at progressive social justice nonprofits. And there's a variety of problems with that, but one of the things we've tried to combat that internally at TCRP in a variety of ways. One of the things we've done that pertains to how we interact with media is we are really thoughtful about who we put out there as a spokesperson on issues that we're working on. So, you know, yes, I am a spokesperson for the organization sometimes, but not all the time. And what we actually like to do is center preferably our clients. Our clients are not always in a position to be talking to media. Sometimes they don't want to, and we always respect that, obviously. But prefer to center our clients or staff members at the Texas Civil Rights Project, whoever is closest to the work. And that has allowed us to get out there, to all of you, a much more diverse and representative assortment of voices than we would if the rule was, that only Mimi gets to talk to the press. And I've been really proud of that. And I think that we've actually pushed some other organizations at times to think about that interaction too. I will also say just a shout out to Ivy Lee, who is our press manager at TCRP. She is amazing in all sorts of ways, but she has called out reporters for reporting on a story and only getting the perspectives of white men on an issue. And she will actually say, I saw that article you wrote, and I don't think that you covered all the viewpoints. And I really, here's a client that I'd like you to talk to, but I'm going to keep an eye on how you report this next time. And so, we really are trying to think about the fact that Texas is an extraordinarily vibrant and diverse place. And I think it's right. I mean, the media has not accurately represented that for a long time, but the media is far from alone. I mean, we're all kind of in it together, which is why we all have to be working to improve.
So I'm going to finish up here with a few questions for students because that's where I am. And also a few of my students followed me onto the panel. So I thought we might get a little advice from the experts for them. And so in my work with my students, I've noticed that I've noticed both uncertainty on how students should help combat mis and disinformation, as well as like if they should even go into the fields altogether, whether or not to fight it. And so Mimi, can you recommend ways college students can get involved in fighting against mis and disinformation, especially in like nonprofit or local government spaces?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've heard a lot of it. Be really careful about what start with yourself. Be really careful about what you're disseminating on social media. And, especially right now with the voting, we're telling people, we have a coalition of groups that are working in this Texas election protection group together. We have a website, texasvoterprotection.org. We work really hard to make sure everything is absolutely accurate. Also, local elected officials have also been involved in a new project to try to really elevate the voices of local officials and other trustworthy faith leaders, civil rights leaders, academics, people who I think are actually trusted by folks, but whose voices get drowned out. So I think that's the place to start. And then I think the other thing is to be a bit skeptical. I think James was modeling that really well. Ask yourself, why is this, powerful person saying this right now? Why is this powerful person pushing out this story? And really trying to push yourself to go deeper than the headline and to figure out the full context. I think that goes a long way. And the one other thing I'll say that I won't run down this rabbit hole, but one of the more hopeful things I've seen recently about misinformation was actually surveys that younger generations are a lot more skeptical of what they see online and are actually leaving platforms like Facebook, at least in part because of some of that skepticism. And so I think that's a very interesting development. I have no idea, where that will go, but I guess I would just encourage students and younger folks to really cultivate that skepticism.
James, what role do you think student-run newspapers or student journalists play in combating mis and disinformation?
Student newspapers, yay! I think student newspapers play a huge role. I am not that far removed from college, but even I feel like, again, with the leaps in technology, like I am not young, I am not hip anymore. And so like, I don't know the best way to reach, young voters and people who are, again, going through the same issues that we were talking about earlier, don't know how to register, don't know how to vote by mail. How do I vote by mail in my home district as opposed to where I am in Austin, So I think student newspapers play a huge role in that, again, in terms of the education role that we have. I think, and it's crazy because every 4 years or every 2 years or however often elections come around, got to do it all over again. And so it's helpful to have student newspapers who have that like really close connection to younger voters, probably are going through it themselves, don't understand. Like if you have a question, probably a bunch of other people have that same question. And so it's good to answer it.
And Justin, what advice would you give students majoring in journalism or related fields who are uncertain about following through on their expected career choices due to current attacks on media?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it's always challenging to try and provide advice to prospective journalists or people who want to get into the field, just because it's such a challenging times and has been, you know, for years now. But first off, I mean, I would say, do not be, I guess, don't let, you know, this kind of rise of, you know, fake news discourse and you know, attacks from, you know, the president and you know, other powerful officials and you know, thought leaders or whatever, you know, discourage you from getting into the field. Don't let that be the thing, I think, to keep you out. I mean, it's tough, no doubt, and especially for women and journalists of color who I think receive the brunt of, you know, the harassment and you know, random anonymous people, you know, getting in their emails and sending them, you know, hate mail because they don't like a story that they wrote, or, you know, getting yelled at in public when, you know, kind of trying to just cover a campaign rally or something. So yeah, I mean, it's no doubt difficult, and on top of all that, you know, there's the economics of the news business right now, like James talked about. You know, hedge funds and private equity firms are kind of just gobbling up local newspapers around the country and gutting them, just kind of extracting profits, and you know, layoffs are constant, and the pay is stagnant and not anywhere near sufficient. You know, not to I feel like I'm being very discouraging now, but I think it is also, you know, not to be, you know, too sappy, but I think now more than ever, you know, journalism is more important than ever in the act of you know, reporting and truth telling and storytelling and narrative writing. I think is more important and more critical than ever. So I would advise people not to be discouraged because of, you know, claims of, you know, or I guess kind of just because of this current environment that we're seeing. I think there's a lot of exciting things going on in journalism. You know, journalists through unionization are you know, kind of fighting back against, you know, broader forces and trying to collectively improve the industry. And I think there's also a lot of you know, creative and exciting things happening to kind of try and remake the conventional bounds of journalism that are really kind of revolutionizing the practice of journalism and what journalism looks like. So yeah, I would, it's also a very exciting time while also being, you know, a little bit scary, but, you know.
Thank you. To wrap up, have we missed anything? Is there anything that y'all want to add, especially as we're in the midst of early voting?
As a civil rights lawyer, I just want to make one more plug for journalism. Like, it can't, I mean, it is literally built into our Constitution. Like, our democracy actually doesn't work without a free and fair and independent press, which is exactly the reason that if you look, as I have looked at it, it's kind of a bleak topic, but I've read a couple of books about how democracies slide out of being healthy democracies and into authoritarianism. And usually the would-be dictator goes after the press first. It is usually the first thing because it is the mechanism that drives transparency and accountability and the type of education that people need to make reasoned decisions in a democracy. And so I know everything you guys have said is true, and it is a really hard industry. And I've been really feeling, you know, lots of empathy for journalists lately, because every time I talk to one on the phone, everybody sounds so tired. I hear it, but it's just so important. So I just wanted to make that little plug for the industry.
I mean, I agree, but I was a journalist before I started my PhD, so it's also in my blood as well. Anything else, Justin or James, before we wrap up tonight, especially in preparation for early voting for those who haven't early voted yet, but many Texans have, which is amazing, or for those who might be voting on election day?
Just really quickly, along the education lines, make a plan to vote, know where you're going to go. Plenty of counties, especially the really big ones, have on their site where you can go vote. And a lot of them, including Dallas and Travis County, show how long the wait is. So that's helpful. And bring your masks, bring your hand sanitizer, all that good stuff. If you're trying to mail vote, you can turn it in at the early voting clerk's office up until election day. And finally, just to end on the same term as everybody else, subscribe to your local newspaper because we need your help.
I'm also going to add to that weekends tend to have the lowest turnout. So for those who are a little anxious about turning out to vote, you can vote this Saturday and Sunday. Counties might have different times, so I won't go into that, but check out your local elections website to figure out what times those are open. With that being said, I want to remind everyone to visit pen.org to learn more about how to combat misinformation. I want to thank Mimi, Justin, and James for joining us tonight. This has been a really great conversation, and I really hope that our attendees and people who might be watching this back later really learned a lot tonight. So thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.